They fired him for telling the truth. They buried his report, erased his name, and made sure no one in the industry would ever hire him again. Logan Mercer, former Navy SEAL, aerospace engineer, father of one, lost everything for doing the right thing. Then the plane he warned them about fell from the sky in a wall of fire and smoke, and while the crowd ran away screaming, Logan ran toward it. What happened next was caught on 17 different cameras. But what those cameras couldn't capture was the choice he made inside that burning wreckage, the choice that said more about who he was than anything else in his life. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you stories about real human courage that Hollywood wouldn't dare make up. Smash the like button if you believe that integrity still matters in this world, and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. This one is going to stay with you. The morning Logan Mercer got fired, he wore the wrong tie. It was a small thing, and he knew it the moment he stepped off the elevator onto the 32nd floor of Asterion Aerospace's Seattle headquarters. Every other man in the corridor wore navy or charcoal, subtle, expensive, the kind of tie that said, "I belong here." Logan's was dark burgundy with a faint diagonal stripe, the one Ava had picked out for him the night before from the back of his closet, standing on her tiptoes in her pajamas and declaring it the serious one, Dad. He hadn't had the heart to tell her it was 4 years old and slightly frayed near the knot. He straightened it in the reflection of the elevator doors and told himself it didn't matter. He was wrong about that too. The executive boardroom at Asterion occupied the entire northwest corner of the building, glass on two sides, the Olympic Mountains visible on clear mornings like a painted backdrop. Logan had been inside it exactly twice before, once for his initial interview, once for the department's safety briefing 6 months ago. Both times he'd felt the faint, uncomfortable awareness that the room was designed to make certain people feel powerful and everyone else feel small. The chairs at the head of the table were 8 inches taller than the chairs along the sides. He'd noticed that the first time and thought it was accidental. He didn't think that anymore. There were 9 people already seated when he entered. He recognized most of them. Harlan Price, the VP of Engineering, who had the practiced smile of a man who had delivered bad news to enough people that it no longer registered on his face. Donna Whitfield from Legal, who was already reviewing something on her tablet and didn't look up. 2 members of the board he knew only by reputation. And at the head of the table, in the tallest chair, Vivian Cross. Logan had worked at Asterion for 14 months. In that time, he had been in the same room as Vivian Cross exactly 7 times, and she had spoken directly to him twice. Once at the department overview meeting where she'd shaken his hand and said, "Engineering's lucky to have you," and once in a hallway conversation that lasted 45 seconds and ended with her saying she'd look forward to reading his quarterly analysis. She hadn't read it. He knew that now. She was 30 years old. He'd looked it up, not out of judgment, but out of something closer to disbelief, because she carried herself like someone a decade older, measured, controlled, with the kind of stillness that only comes from either extreme confidence or the daily performance of it. She had an MBA from Wharton, had founded 2 startups before 30, and had taken over Asterion after its previous CEO died of a heart attack mid-restructuring. The business press called her a wunderkind. The engineers in Logan's department called her something less flattering, usually after the second beer at Friday happy hours. Logan had tried to stay neutral. That wasn't easy now. He sat down in the chair they indicated, middle of the long side, directly across from Harlan Price, and set his folder on the table. The folder contained 47 pages. He'd checked the page count 3 times that morning. "Logan." Vivian Cross didn't look up from her own documents immediately. When she did, her expression was professionally pleasant, the kind that gave nothing away. "Thank you for coming in." "Of course," he said. "We've asked you here to discuss the engineering report you submitted last Thursday regarding the Vanguard X7. She paused. "Specifically, your recommendation to halt the certification process." "Yes." He opened his folder to the first page, though he didn't need it. He'd written every word. "I've identified a structural resonance issue in the empennage assembly. The horizontal stabilizer attachment point specifically. Under certain load conditions at cruise altitude, the cyclic stress distribution doesn't match the design specs. The variance is within tolerance on paper, but the real-world testing data from the last 4 high-altitude runs shows a pattern of microfracturing that the stress models didn't predict. He slid the relevant pages across the table toward Price. I've flagged the specific data sets on pages 11 through 19. The failure mode would be progressive, not immediately catastrophic, but under sustained operational stress over a period of months. Logan, Vivian's voice was even. I've read your report. Then you've seen the fatigue curves on. I've read it. The pleasantness was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, like a light going off one room over. And I've had our chief engineering team review your findings. He hadn't known that. He kept his face neutral. Their assessment, Vivian continued, folding her hands on the table, is that your methodology is sound, but your conclusions are overstated. The microfracturing you've identified falls within acceptable engineering margins. Your projection of progressive failure assumes a worst-case operational scenario that doesn't reflect real-world usage patterns. Logan was quiet for a moment. With respect, he said, worst-case scenarios are exactly what certification testing is supposed to account for. That's the entire point of the process. An aircraft doesn't fail under average conditions. It fails under the conditions nobody planned for. We're aware of how certification works, Harlan Price said, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man who had decided the conversation was already over. I know you are, Logan said, and he made a conscious effort to keep his own voice steady, to not let the thing coiling in his chest come through in his words. I'm not questioning anyone's understanding. I'm questioning the data. Because the data is telling us something that the models didn't predict. And in my experience, 14 years in aerospace, 7 of them in naval aviation systems, when the data surprises you, that's the moment you slow down, not speed up. The Vanguard X7 certification timeline is tied to a government contract valued at $4.3 billion, Vivian said. A 6 to 8 month delay, which is what your recommendation would require, would constitute a material breach. The financial exposure is significant. I understand that. I'm not sure you do. She wasn't being cruel. That was almost the harder part. She wasn't angry, wasn't flustered, just certain, in the way that people are certain when they've already decided and are going through the motions of the conversation that has to happen before the decision takes effect. This company employs 2,400 people. This contract represents 30% of our annual revenue. Halting certification on the basis of a projection, not a confirmed failure, a projection, based on data that our own engineering team has reviewed and found inconclusive. It's not inconclusive, Logan said quietly. It's uncomfortable. The room went very still. Vivian Cross looked at him for a moment with something that might have been surprise and might have been the opposite of it. That's a serious accusation, she said. It's not an accusation. It's an observation. He kept his eyes on hers. I've been in rooms like this before, not exactly like this, but close enough, where the data says one thing and the schedule says another, and everyone in the room knows what the data says, but there's enough professional ambiguity to make the uncomfortable choice feel optional. I've seen what happens when people take that option. He stopped. I had friends who flew an aircraft that someone signed off on because the financial exposure was significant. I'd rather have this conversation now than the other conversation later. The silence stretched. Then Vivian Cross straightened very slightly in her chair, and Logan knew, with the specific sinking clarity of a man who has been in enough briefings to recognize the moment a decision becomes a verdict, that he had already lost. Your dedication to safety is noted and appreciated, she said. However, Asterion's engineering leadership has reviewed your report and reached a different conclusion. We will be proceeding with the certification timeline. She looked at Donna Whitfield from legal, who was already sliding a document across the table. Given the disruption that your report has created internally, and given the concern that further circulation of your conclusions could cause reputational harm to the company during a critical pre-launch period, we've made the decision to end your employment with Asterion, effective today. You'll find the severance terms in the agreement in front of you. Logan didn't look at the agreement. He looked at Vivian Cross. You understand, he said, that if I'm right, thank you, Mr. Mercer. Harlan Price stood, which was the signal that the meeting was over, which was the signal that Logan was already gone. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. He called his sister Maya from the parking garage, sitting in his 6-year-old Ford pickup with the engine off, the folder of 47 pages on the passenger seat. "How did it go?" she asked, and he could hear her hoping in her voice, which made it harder. "They didn't go for it," he said. "Logan, they let me go." The silence on her end lasted about 3 seconds. "Those absolute don't," he said. Not because he disagreed, but because he was already doing the math in his head, the way he always did, running the calculations on how bad it actually was before he let himself feel how bad it was. The mortgage on the house in Renton, Ava's school, the truck payment, his savings, which were not nothing but were also not comfortable. "I need to think." "You need to not think for 5 minutes and just let yourself be." "Maya," he exhaled. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." "I'm not fine," he agreed, "but I'm going to be." "Can you pick up Ava from school today? I need to make some calls." She said she would. He sat in the parking garage for another 12 minutes, very still, looking at the folder. Then he picked it up, put it carefully in the back seat, and drove home. Tolkien. He spent the next 3 weeks making calls. Some of them were to former colleagues, which were awkward and brief and generally ended with vague expressions of sympathy and references to how tight things were right now, how the industry's in a weird place. One of them was to the FAA, where he spoke with a mid-level aviation safety official named Reeves, who listened carefully, asked intelligent questions, and then told him that without internal documentation supporting his findings, documentation that Asterion had, of course, not provided, the regulatory path would be lengthy, the outcome uncertain, and that Logan should manage his expectations. Another call was to an attorney who specialized in wrongful termination, who told him his case was solid and would likely settle, but that the NDA he'd signed as a condition of his severance complicated things significantly. He didn't tell Ava any of this. She was 8. She knew he'd left his job because he was home when she got off the bus every afternoon instead of at the office, and she had the sharp perceptiveness of a child who had learned early to read the atmosphere of a room. She asked him once, carefully, if they were going to be okay, and he told her yes, and meant it, and hoped he was right. "Are you sad?" she asked. They were at the kitchen table. She was doing homework, long division, the kind that required her to show her work, which she found philosophically objectionable. "A little," he said, because she'd always been able to tell when he was lying. "Because of the job?" "Yeah." She thought about that for a moment, erasing something on her paper with the specific intensity she brought to everything. "You know what you always tell me when somebody's unfair to me at school?" "What do I always tell you?" "You say that other people's bad choices don't change who you are." She looked up at him. "So, you're still the same person who did the right thing, right?" He looked at his daughter, her mother's dark eyes, his own stubborn jaw, and something in her expression that was entirely her own. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." "Okay." She went back to her long division. "Then stop making that face." Well, by the second month, the settlement money from the severance was keeping them above water, but Logan knew it wouldn't last. His professional reputation, it turned out, had been more thoroughly managed than he'd understood at the time of his firing. He'd applied to 4 aerospace firms in the region. 3 hadn't responded. The 4th, a mid-sized contractor he'd done good work for earlier in his career, had a recruiter call him, apologize with genuine discomfort in her voice, and explain that they'd received feedback from industry contacts that made them unable to proceed at this time. She didn't say from whom. She didn't have to. Asterion had been thorough. He got a job driving for a regional delivery service because the pay was honest and the hours were predictable enough that he could drop Ava at school in the mornings and be home before dark most days. He drove a white van with the company logo on the side and wore a vest with his name on it and did not tell any of his former colleagues about it, not because he was ashamed. He told himself that, and mostly believed it, but because he didn't want the conversation that would follow. He was good at the job. He'd always been good at jobs that required route planning and time management and staying calm when things went sideways. Skills that transferred more directly from the SEAL teams than anyone at the aerospace firms had probably expected. At night, after Ava was asleep, he sometimes sat at the kitchen table with his original engineering report and read through it the way you read something you want to believe you got wrong. He never found anything he'd gotten wrong. That was the complicated part. There was no comfort available in the possibility of error. The Vanguard X7 was scheduled to complete certification in 11 weeks. He'd read it in an aviation trade publication, a brief item in the industry news, accompanied by a quote from Vivian Cross about Asterion's commitment to setting new standards in aviation safety. He'd read the quote twice. Then he'd closed his laptop and gone to bed. Every morning, when he dropped Ava at school, they had a ritual that had started when she was 5 and that neither of them had ever formally agreed to continue. It had simply never stopped. He would pull up to the drop-off circle, and before she got out, she would ask him, "What's the lesson today?" It had started as a game, a way to fill the last 2 minutes of the drive. He'd say something simple, say, "Be kind to people who are having a hard day, you don't always know what's going on with them," or, "If you make a mistake, say so." People respect that more than they respect someone who pretends they didn't. She'd solemnly note it and get out, and that was that. He hadn't intended it to become the thing it became, but it had. On the morning 3 months after his firing, on a Tuesday in October, she asked him the question the way she always did, backpack already on, hand on the door. "What's the lesson today, Dad?" He thought about it for a moment. He thought about the report in the kitchen drawer, the certification timeline, the phone calls that hadn't gone anywhere, the white delivery van, the frayed burgundy tie. "Real strength," he said finally, "is choosing to protect other people even when life has treated you like it doesn't owe you anything." She sat with that for a second. "That's a long one." "Yeah." "Is that about you?" He glanced at her. She was watching him with those dark, perceptive eyes. "Go to school, Ava." She grinned, his wife's grin, sudden and complete, and pushed the door open and was gone, running toward the entrance with her backpack bouncing. And Logan sat in the drop-off circle until the car behind him honked, and then he put the truck in gear and drove to work. 3 months later. 17 cameras, a burning plane, and a choice he hadn't known he was still capable of making. The Tuesday had happened, Logan was running behind schedule. He'd taken a wrong turn near the industrial district south of Cascade for a regional airport. Not because he didn't know the route, but because a water main break had closed 2 blocks of Hargrove Street, and the Detour app on his phone had sent him through a neighborhood where half the street signs were missing. He had 11 more deliveries and 3 hours to do them in, and the last package in the stack was a medical supply box marked fragile that he'd had to rearrange the entire van to keep from shifting on corners. He was eating a granola bar at a red light when he heard it. Not an explosion, exactly. More like a pressure shift. A deep concussive thud that he felt in his sternum before he heard it with his ears. He'd heard sounds like that before, in places where sounds like that meant something immediate and terrible, and his body responded to the memory before his mind had processed the information. He sat up straighter, scanning. The smoke came from the northeast, a column of it, thick and dark, the kind that meant accelerant, jet fuel, his brain supplied without being asked, climbing against the gray October sky at an angle that told him the wind was pushing it southeast. He was already moving before the light changed. The Cascade Fear flight path ran directly over the industrial corridor. He knew that because he'd driven this route for 3 months and had learned the geography of it the way he learned most things, systematically, without really meaning to. He turned north on Delacroix, then east on the service road that ran parallel to the airport's outer perimeter fence, and he could see it now. A dark mass maybe 400 yards beyond the runway's end, in the scrubby field where the airport property met a drainage easement, burning with the particular intensity of something that had been full of fuel when it hit. He pulled the van to the shoulder behind 3 other stopped cars. A woman was out of her vehicle already, phone up, recording. A man in a construction vest was on his phone, talking fast. From here, Logan could see the shape of the aircraft through the smoke, or what remained of the shape. The fuselage had broken at roughly the midpoint. The forward section was largely intact, tilted at a steep angle with the nose buried. The aft section was fully involved, orange flame eating through the tail assembly exactly where he had said it would fail, exactly where the horizontal stabilizer met the fuselage, exactly where the microfractures he'd tracked in 4 rounds of testing had been spreading incrementally for the better part of a year. He had 47 pages that told him this was going to happen. He sat in the van for approximately 4 seconds, looking at the burning aircraft. Then he got out. There was no fence on this section of the perimeter, just a low concrete barrier meant to stop vehicles, which Logan stepped over without slowing down. The grass on the other side was long and dry from the October drought, and it crunched under his feet as he walked, then jogged, then ran. Behind him, he could hear someone shouting, the construction worker probably, telling him to stop, to wait for emergency services. All the reasonable things that reasonable people said when they hadn't yet done the math on how long it would take for emergency services to arrive versus how long a fuel fire left an aluminum fuselage structurally intact. He knew the math. 14 years in aerospace, before that 7 years in environments where the difference between arriving 30 seconds early and 30 seconds late was a question he didn't let himself think about anymore. He ran. The heat hit him at about 150 yards out, a wall of it, radiating from the aft section, distorting the air above the burning wreckage into those liquid heat shimmer waves that made everything beyond them look unreal. Logan pulled his delivery vest up over the lower half of his face, which was useless in any serious sense, but better than nothing, and angled toward the forward section, where the fire hadn't yet reached, and where, if anyone had survived the initial impact, they would be. He heard the child before he saw her. It cut through everything. The roar of the fire, the groan of stressed metal, the sound of his own breathing, the way a child's crying always cuts through everything when you're a parent, like it operates on a frequency your nervous system is permanently tuned to. He'd felt it when Ava was small and woke at night, that immediate animal alertness that pulled him out of sleep with his feet already on the floor. He felt it now. Hey. He was at the forward fuselage break, where the aircraft's skin had peeled back and created an opening about 3 feet wide. Smoke was coming through it, but not fire. Not yet. Hey, I hear you. Keep making noise, okay? Keep talking to me. The crying didn't stop, but it changed, became more directed, less purely terrified and more answering, which told him the child was conscious and responsive, and that was enough. He went through the opening sideways, one arm up to protect his face. Inside the forward cabin, the world was tilted roughly 20 degrees to port, which meant everything had slid. Seats, personal items, the entire environmental sense of the space. Emergency lighting was still functioning, casting everything in a dim amber that was worse than darkness in some ways, because it suggested structure where the structure might not hold. The smoke was thicker in here, and Logan dropped to his knees immediately because the air near the floor was better. A principle so basic it had saved enough people's lives that it had made it into every survival training he'd ever done. She was in the third row from the front, a girl maybe 5 or 6 years old, still buckled into her seat, which had partially separated from the floor mounts and tilted forward at an angle that had trapped the buckle mechanism under the warped seat rail. She had a cut on her forehead. Not deep, but head wounds bleed dramatically, and her face and the front of her jacket were covered with it, which probably had something to do with why she was as terrified as she was. Hey, Logan said, getting down to her level, making his voice the thing he'd learned to make it in the teams, low and even and containing, communicating a calm he wasn't necessarily feeling, but knew she needed to feel coming from him. My name's Logan. What's your name? Chloe. Her voice was thin and ragged from crying. Chloe? Okay. You're okay. I'm going to get you out of here. He was already examining the buckle, feeling for the release mechanism with his fingers because the amber light wasn't quite enough to see clearly. The seat rail had come down across the buckle housing at an angle. He needed something to lever it up 6, maybe 8 inches, and then the buckle would release normally. Chloe, I need you to hold very still for me. Can you do that? It smells bad, she said. I know, hold still. He looked around the immediate area. 2 rows back, a service cart had come free from its housing and wedged against the cabin wall. Aluminum, lightweight, with a handle. He got to it in 4 seconds, worked the handle free in another 10, came back. Chloe was watching him with enormous eyes, holding very still the way children do when they've decided to trust someone completely and are concentrating on their side of the deal. He wedged the handle under the seat rail, used his body weight as a lever, felt the rail lift with a groan of stressed aluminum, and simultaneously hit the buckle release with his other hand. It released on the first try, which he was grateful for and did not take for granted. He got Chloe in his arms. She grabbed his neck and held on with both hands, which helped, and moved for the opening. The smoke was denser now. He could feel the temperature in the cabin rising, which meant the fire was advancing through the structure faster than he'd estimated. He went through the opening and straightened up, and the October air hit him like something physical after the interior of the cabin, and he covered the distance back to the perimeter at something close to a run, Chloe's face pressed against his shoulder. At the concrete barrier, two people reached over to take her from him. The woman who'd been recording, and a man Logan hadn't seen before, maybe a driver who'd stopped after him. He let them take her, made sure she was stable, and caught a 3-second look at her face, the fear already shifting toward something else, toward the complicated relief of a person who has stopped being in immediate danger and hasn't yet processed what happened. "There's more inside, but," Logan said. He wasn't certain of that, but the aircraft had been carrying passengers. He'd seen at least 5 more rows of seating in the forward section, and not all of them were empty. He'd moved fast enough that he hadn't done a complete sweep. "Man, you need to wait for the man with the construction vest started. Logan was already going back. The second pass was harder. He covered the same ground faster because he knew it now, but the smoke coming from the fuselage break was significantly thicker, and when he went through, he was working on partial breath, feeling his way more than seeing. He moved aft from the opening, checking each row, running his hands along the seat tops in the amber-lit murk. First row clear, second row. There were personal items, a laptop bag, a child's backpack. Someone had been sitting here. He checked under the seats, between the seats. Nothing. Third row, where Chloe had been. He kept moving. Fourth row. He almost missed her because she wasn't making any noise. Vivian Cross was in the fourth row window seat, on the starboard side, the high side of the tilted fuselage, which meant she was above the major debris concentration. She was conscious but not fully, her eyes open and tracking but with the unfocused quality of someone working through serious disorientation. There was blood from somewhere above her hairline. Her right arm was pressed against the seat back at an angle that wasn't right, and when Logan looked down, he understood why. A section of overhead bin had come down, and the edge of it had caught her forearm, and the twisted metal was pinning her against the seat back with enough force that she couldn't move it without something to release the pressure. He recognized her. It took him approximately 2 seconds to recognize her because she looked different here, smaller somehow, without the 32nd floor boardroom and the height-adjusted chair and the professional pleasantness that gave nothing away. She just looked like a person who was hurt and afraid. She looked, specifically, like a person who knew where she was and knew that what she was in was on fire and could not free herself from it. He recognized her, and then he stopped recognizing her because it wasn't relevant. "Can you hear me?" He was at her side, already assessing the overhead bin section, figuring the leverage problem. Her eyes focused on him. The recognition took longer for her than it had for him. She was running it through whatever fog the impact had left. And then it landed, and her expression went through several things quickly, none of which she had control over. "You," she said. "Yeah." He was already working on the bin section, finding the points of contact, mapping the force vectors in his head. "Can you feel your feet?" "Yes." Her voice was steadier than her eyes. "Yes, I can feel them." "Can you move them?" She shifted her legs. "Yes." "Good. Your arm is pinned. I'm going to lift this. When I do, pull your arm toward you, and don't stop pulling until it's clear. Don't wait to see if it's going to work. Just pull." "Okay." "I need you to tell me you understand." "I understand." She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't categorize and didn't spend time trying to. The bin section was heavier than it looked, composite material full of stored items that were still inside it. And the angle was wrong, the leverage point too far from where he needed the lift to be effective. He repositioned twice, found the angle, and put everything he had into it, driving with his legs the way you lift things you're not supposed to be able to lift, feeling it in his back and his shoulders and his lungs, because the air in here was not good air anymore. It moved. Not elegantly. It lurched upward about 6 inches with a sound like tearing paper, and Logan held it there, held it, and in his peripheral vision he saw Vivian yank her arm free with a sound that might have been pain and might have been relief, and was probably both. He let the bin section down and turned to her, upright and moving. Now. My arm. You can use it. It hurts, but you can use it. We need to move. She used it. He got her out of the seat and moving, and she was faster on her feet than he expected, which meant she wasn't as disoriented as she'd looked, or she was running on whatever the body produces when it understands that slowing down is not an option. They moved toward the opening, Logan behind her, one hand on her shoulder partly to guide her, and partly because the smoke was bad enough now that maintaining contact was practical. He heard the sound the fuselage makes when it's about to go, a deep metallic groan that he recognized from accident investigation reports, the sound of a structure that has been holding under stress for the last time. He had 2 years of material science in that groan, and he understood what it meant. "Move," he said, and shoved her ahead of him toward the opening. She went through. He was right behind her, and they were 3 strides clear of the fuselage when the aft section's fire reached the forward fuel lines. The explosion wasn't massive. This wasn't a movie. It was a structural combustion event, which is different, but it was enough to throw a wave of superheated air and debris outward from the breach point, and Logan covered Vivian with his body and his arms and took the wave across his back and the back of his legs. It burned. He was aware of it burning, and then he was aware of the ground under his knees, and then he was aware of people coming toward them, 2 or 3 of them, shouting things he couldn't quite assemble into sentences yet. Vivian Cross was on the ground beside him, alive and looking at him. He sat back on his heels and breathed. "You're back," she said. She wasn't being dramatic about it. She was looking at him the way people look when they're assessing something and don't want to say how bad it is. "I know," he said. "It looks... I know." He looked back at the aircraft. The forward section was fully involved now, the fire completing what the impact had started. Another minute and the opening they'd come through wouldn't be an opening anymore. He ran the math on that and let himself feel, briefly, what it meant. He became aware, in stages, of the sounds around him. Sirens. 3 separate tones getting louder, close. People talking, several of them, the words becoming more coherent as his head cleared. A woman nearby. The one who'd been recording, saying something into her phone, and then cutting through all of it with the particular quality of a sound he never stopped being alert to, no matter where he was or how bad his back felt. "Dad?" He turned. Ava was standing 40 feet away at the concrete barrier, school backpack on her back, absolute terror on her face, a teacher or aide from the after-school pickup program standing behind her with a hand on her shoulder, clearly having pulled over when they saw the smoke. Ava had seen the smoke too. She had seen him run across the field. She had seen the explosion. He got to his feet. His back screamed at him. He walked to his daughter, and she ducked under the barrier and ran the last 20 feet and hit him somewhere around the midsection and held on with both arms. He put his arms around her and held on back. "I'm okay," he said into the top of her head. "I've got you." She didn't say anything. She just held on tighter. Behind them, the first emergency vehicles were breaching the perimeter. Behind them, 17 cameras had captured everything. The man in the delivery vest running toward the fire while everyone else ran away, coming out once with a child and going back in alone, coming out the second time with a woman pressed against him, going down on his knees in the burning grass and covering her with his own body when the shockwave hit. The woman in those videos would be identified within hours, so would the man. And by morning, the country would understand exactly who those 2 people were to each other. But right now, in the long October grass beside the concrete barrier, Logan Mercer was just holding his daughter, and his back was burning, and none of the math he'd done in the last 3 months had predicted this. Ava pulled back enough to look at his face. Her eyes were wet. "Was that the plane?" she asked. "The one you told them about?" He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "That was the one." She absorbed that. She was 8 years old, and she absorbed it the way she absorbed most things. Us, seriously, like it mattered, like she was going to need to have thought carefully about it later. "You went in anyway," she said. He didn't answer that. It wasn't really a question. Ava looked back at the burning wreckage, then back at him. She reached up and touched the side of his face with one hand, the way she sometimes did when she was trying to figure out what he was feeling and he wasn't telling her. "That was the lesson today," she said quietly. "Wasn't it?" He looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it was." Somewhere across the field, he could hear the emergency responders working. He could hear Vivian Cross's voice, clear and controlled, telling someone she could walk. He could hear the fire doing what fires do when they're finishing something. He stood there with Ava until a paramedic reached them and asked him to sit down, which he did, and they started working on his back, and he kept one hand on Ava's shoulder the whole time, because she hadn't let go of him yet, and he wasn't going to be the one to let go first. The burns on Logan's back were second degree across roughly 30% of the surface area between his shoulder blades and the base of his spine. The ER doctor who treated him, a tired woman in her 50s named Doctor Anand, who had the practice deficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to have stopped being impressed by most things, told him he was lucky, which was technically accurate and practically meaningless, and then told him the burns would heal fully in 4 to 6 weeks with proper wound care, which was the more useful information. "You're going to be uncomfortable," she said, which was already true and getting more true by the minute as the adrenaline metabolized out of his system and left his nerve endings to report on what had actually happened to them. "I've been uncomfortable before," Logan said. Dr. Anand looked at him over the top of her glasses. "Not like this." She wasn't wrong about that either. Maya had arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after Logan did, slightly breathless, still in her work clothes from the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. She'd seen it on her phone. Someone in the teacher's lounge had the news pulled up on their laptop, and had called Logan's cell 4 times on the way, reaching him on the 3rd call when he was already in the back being processed. She'd walked into the treatment bay, looked at him lying face down on the gurney while Dr. Anand worked on his back and said, "I'm not even surprised," which was the most Maya thing she had ever said to him, and which meant, in the specific language of their siblinghood, that she was more frightened than she could manage to express directly. Ava was with her. She sat in the plastic chair against the wall and watched Dr. Anand work and didn't look away, which was another thing about his daughter he'd never had the occasion to test before and now knew. "Does it hurt?" Ava asked at one point. "Some," Logan said. "On a scale of 1 to 10. 5. Maya, standing near the door with her arms crossed, said, "Liar." 6, Logan amended. Ava nodded seriously and went back to watching. She was processing something. He could see it in the particular stillness she went into when she was working through something she wasn't ready to talk about yet. He'd seen the same stillness the night they told her that her mother wasn't coming home from the hospital. He'd seen it the first day of 2nd grade when the teacher had said something careless about families, and Ava had come home carrying it quietly in her chest for 2 hours before it finally came out at the dinner table. He recognized the stillness. He let it be. He was admitted for the night. Standard protocol for burns of that severity, Dr. Anand said, partly for wound management and partly to monitor for smoke inhalation effects that sometimes didn't present fully for several hours. Maya took Ava home around 9. Ava hugged him at the door of the room carefully, avoiding his back, with a precision that suggested she'd thought about exactly where to put her arms. "I'll be home tomorrow," he told her. "I know." She pulled back and looked at him. "You should sleep." "I will." She studied him for another moment with those dark, serious eyes. Then she nodded, like she'd decided something, and went with Maya down the hallway, and Logan watched them go and lay back carefully in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the floor, the monitors, the cartwheels, the muffled PA system, and did not sleep for a long time. He didn't have a television in the room, but he had his phone, and by 10 o'clock that night he understood the basic shape of what was happening outside the hospital walls. The videos had been everywhere within 2 hours of the crash, 17 different angles, as it turned out. Dashboard cameras, phone cameras, a traffic monitoring system mounted on a pole near the airport perimeter that had a direct sightline to the entire field. The best angle was from a woman named Terry Okafor, who had been sitting in her car on the service road and had filmed continuously from the moment Logan stepped over the concrete barrier until the paramedics reached them, and her footage was clean and steady and showed everything. It showed a man in a delivery vest running toward a burning aircraft while everyone else stood still or ran away. It showed him going through the fuselage break without hesitating. It showed him coming out with a small girl and handing her to bystanders and turning around and going back in. It showed the explosion and the debris wave, and the moment Logan Mercer put his body between that wave and the woman he was carrying and went down on his knees in the long, dry grass. By morning, it had been viewed 40 million times. By the time Logan woke up at 6:15, still face down in the hospital bed with his back wrapped and his phone battery at 11%, Terry Okafor was doing a live interview on a morning news program, and Logan's name had been identified, and the story beneath the story, the one about who he was and who the woman he'd saved was and what had happened between them 3 months ago, was already surfacing in pieces across every platform that existed. His phone had 247 notifications. He plugged it in and called Maya. "Yeah," she said, picking up on the first ring. "I've been awake for a while." "How's Ava?" "Still asleep, Logan." "I know. It's everywhere." "It's really—" She stopped. "It's everywhere." "I know," he said again. He lay there for a moment, looking at the water stain on the hospital ceiling that was shaped approximately like the state of Minnesota. He thought about the 47 pages in the kitchen drawer at home. He thought about Harlan Price's face when he'd stood up to signal the meeting was over. He thought about the certification timeline he'd read in the trade publication, the brief news item, Vivian Cross's quote about new standards in aviation safety. He thought about Chloe, the girl from the third row, whose last name he didn't know, and whether she was okay. "How's the little girl?" he asked. "The one I got out first, did they say?" Maya was quiet for a second. "They're saying she's fine. Minor head laceration, no concussion. Her parents were on the ground waiting for the flight. Logan, they've been on the news. Her father is—" Her voice did something complicated. "He's not doing very well with the cameras." Logan could imagine. He'd experienced approximately 20 minutes of cameras last night before the paramedics had gotten him into the ambulance, and 20 minutes had been enough to understand why people who'd never dealt with them before found them destabilizing. The sense of being consumed by something that had its own momentum and didn't care what you were actually feeling. "I want to talk to them," he said, "when things settle down a little." "Of course you do," Maya said, and she sounded like she was smiling, which was the sister version of saying something kind that she'd never say directly. The hospital room door opened at 7:40, and a man Logan didn't know came in carrying a tray and a press credential lanyard and the professionally apologetic expression of someone who knew he was intruding and had decided to do it anyway. Logan looked at him. "I'm not doing interviews. I'm not press," the man said, setting the tray down on the overbed table. "I'm Nathan Reese. I'm with the NTSB. If you're feeling up to it, we'd like to talk." Nathan Reese was 40-something, trim, wearing a jacket that looked like it had been put on at 4 in the morning and had known it. He had a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil and the specific quality of attention that Logan associated with people who were very good at their jobs, fully present, recording everything, giving nothing away about what they were thinking. He had 2 colleagues with him, a woman named Vargas and a younger man whose name Logan didn't catch. Vargas had a laptop. Logan told them what he'd seen and done in sequence, starting from when he heard the pressure wave in his truck and ending when the paramedics reached him and Vivian in the grass. He was precise about details, distances, timing, what he'd seen inside the fuselage, the structural condition of the forward section, the location and nature of the overhead bin failure. He'd spent enough time in after-action debriefs to know how to give a factual account without editorializing, and he did that now. Reese listened without interrupting. When Logan finished, Reese made a note and then looked at him. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "before you were employed by Asterion Aerospace, what was your professional background?" 14 years aerospace engineering, 7 of those in naval aviation systems, the rest civilian, structural certification mostly, some propulsion. Reese made another note. "And during your time at Asterion, you submitted a report recommending a halt to the Vanguard X-7 certification process." It wasn't a question. I did, Logan said. That report was dated 11 months ago. 10 months, 3 weeks? Reese looked at him steadily. We're going to need a copy of that report, Mr. Mercer. I have 47 pages, Logan said. I'll get you whatever you need. Reese nodded slowly, and there was something in his expression, not quite satisfaction, not quite anger, something between them, that told Logan the investigators had already found things inside that aircraft that the report had predicted, and they were in the process of understanding how much they should have known sooner. One more question, Reese said, and I want to be clear that you're under no obligation to answer anything beyond what directly relates to the incident. He paused. When you went back in the second time, when you found Ms. Cross, was there a moment where you recognized her? The room was quiet. Yes, Logan said. And? Logan looked at him, and I got her out. Reese held his gaze for a long moment. Then he made one final note and closed his legal pad and thanked Logan for his time. And the three of them left, and Logan lay back in the hospital bed and felt his back and thought about things he was not going to be able to stop thinking about for a while. He was discharged at noon the following day. Maya picked him up, alone, and drove him home in near silence, which was the kind of communication they did best when things were serious. She'd put grocery bags in the back seat, things for the wound care, things for the house, things she'd decided he needed without asking because asking would have given him the opportunity to say he was fine. Ava's at school, Maya said, turning onto their street. Good. She didn't want to go. I know she didn't. I told her you'd want her to. I did want her to. Maya glanced at him sideways. There are 2 news vans parked on your block. He'd known there would be. I'll go in through the back. Logan, she stopped in front of the house, engine running. You don't have to talk to any of them. I know. But the story is going to get told one way or another. The NTSB findings are going to take time, he said. Investigations take time. The report is already out there. Someone at Asterion leaked it last night. Not your original report, an internal memo. From Harlan Price to 3 of the board members dated 2 weeks after you were fired. She stopped. It acknowledges the fracture data. It recommends accelerating the certification timeline and describes your report as, quote, manageable exposure. Logan sat with that. Outside, a light rain had started, the first real rain of October, tapping on the windshield in irregular patterns. Manageable exposure, he said. Yeah. He got out of the car. He spent the next 4 days at home, managing his wound care, answering emails from his attorney, and mostly trying to give Ava as normal a version of their daily life as was possible with 2 news vans on the block that had become 5 news vans by the end of the first day and 7 by the end of the second. He did not give interviews. He let his attorney handle the press inquiries and the official statements, of which there were many, and he tried to keep Ava's schedule intact: school, homework, dinner, the kitchen table. She was quieter than usual. Not unhappy exactly, but sitting with something, the way she'd been sitting with something since the hospital. It came out on the 3rd evening, over plates of the pasta she'd helped him make, which she could do now mostly without supervision and was unreasonably proud of. People at school are talking about you, she said. I figured. Mrs. Carver said you were a hero. He was quiet for a moment. What did you say? I said you were my dad. She twisted pasta on her fork with great concentration. Is that the same thing? He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. I think so, he said. I think that might be the best version of the same thing. She considered that. Tyler Brentwood said you were stupid for going back in to save the lady who fired you. What did you say to Tyler Brentwood? I said he was confusing stupidity with having a principle. She paused. Is that right? Is that what it was? He put his fork down. Yeah, Ava. That's exactly what it was. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her pasta. Vivian Cross's public statement came on the 5th day. Logan heard about it from Maya first, and then watched the full footage on his laptop, sitting at the kitchen table in the afternoon while Ava was at school, and the wound care nurse had already come and gone. It had been recorded in what looked like a hotel conference room, not Asterion's offices, which Logan understood meant she no longer had access to Asterian's offices. And she was seated at a small table with no visible notes, which meant she'd memorized it or was speaking without a script, which, given what she said, seemed more likely. She looked different than she had in the boardroom. Not worse exactly, just less assembled. There were shadows under her eyes and her hair was less controlled, and she had a bandage visible on her forearm where the overhead bin had caught her, and she sat very straight in the way that people sit when they are making a physical effort to hold themselves together. 11 months ago, she said, an engineer named Logan Mercer submitted a report to Asterion Aerospace predicting, with specific technical detail, the exact structural failure that caused the crash of Vanguard X7. I read that report. I dismissed it. I allowed company leadership to treat it as a financial liability rather than an engineering warning, and I allowed Logan Mercer to be terminated and his professional reputation to be systematically damaged, because his findings were inconvenient to a timeline I had decided was non-negotiable. She paused. She was looking directly into the camera with an expression that was uncomfortable to watch, not because it was performed, but because it clearly wasn't. People were aboard that aircraft, she continued. People were hurt. And the only reason I am alive to say this is that the man whose career I destroyed chose to go back into a burning aircraft for me. I have been trying to find a way to say what I want to say about that, and I've decided there isn't one. There is no version of this where what I did is defensible, and there is no version of what Logan Mercer did that I can adequately account for. I can only tell you that he was right from the beginning, that I was wrong, that the people who were hurt aboard that aircraft deserved better than what this company gave them, and that I intend to spend whatever is necessary, time, resources, personal cost, making sure the full truth of what happened inside Asterion is available to investigators, to regulators, and to the public. She folded her hands on the table. Logan Mercer did not have to go back in for me. He had 47 reasons not to. I'm alive because he chose compassion over what I deserved. I don't have a way to answer that. I can only try to be worth it. The statement was 31 minutes long in total. Logan watched all of it once, then sat in the kitchen for a while without doing anything. His phone buzzed. Maya, did you watch it? He typed back, yeah. And? He thought about the boardroom, the burgundy tie. Harlan Price standing up to signal the meeting was over. The drive home with the 47 pages on the passenger seat. The 3 weeks of phone calls that went nowhere. The white delivery van. The field. The fire. The amber light inside the tilted cabin. The fracture point at the horizontal stabilizer exactly where he'd said it would be. He thought about Vivian Cross's face in the 4th row of a burning aircraft, smaller than she'd seemed in any boardroom, afraid in the specific way a person is afraid when they understand exactly what they're in and can't get themselves out of it. He typed back, she told the truth. Maya's response took a minute. That's not nothing. No, he typed. It's not. The NTSB preliminary findings were released 6 days later. They were careful and technical in the way preliminary findings always are, full of conditional language and reference data sets. But the core of it was not unclear. A progressive fatigue failure in the horizontal stabilizer attachment assembly, consistent with microfracturing patterns identified in pre-certification testing, had propagated under operational stress until it produced a catastrophic structural event during descent. The failure location and mode were, as Nathan Reese had privately acknowledged to Logan in the hospital room, consistent in every material respect with the engineering report submitted 10 months prior. The internal Asterion memo, the one from Harlan Price describing Logan's report as manageable exposure, was confirmed as authentic that same day. By the following morning, it had been shared more than the rescue video. Asterion's board of directors issued a statement accepting Vivian Cross's resignation, which was framed as mutual and voluntary in ways that convinced approximately no one. Harlan Price was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, as were 2 other senior executives whose names had appeared in the memo chain. The Department of Justice announced it was reviewing the documents. Logan's attorney called him the morning after the preliminary findings dropped. Her name was Caroline Webb, and she was competent and direct and had been telling Logan for 2 months that his case was solid, and now she was telling him what solid meant in practice. The wrongful termination case is essentially over, she said. They'll want to settle before discovery surfaces anything else. I'd expect contact within the week. The number will be significant. Okay, Logan said. You should also know that you're being cited by name in the preliminary findings as the source of the original warning. The FAA Safety Division has been in touch with my office. They want your input on proposed regulatory changes around whistleblower protections for engineers and certification processes. That I'll do, Logan said immediately. I thought you might. She paused. Logan, you're going to be asked to testify, possibly publicly, in front of a congressional subcommittee, depending on how far this goes. He thought about Ava at the kitchen table doing long division, philosophically objecting to showing her work. He thought about what he would tell her before she got out of the car on that particular morning. That's fine, he said. I'll say what I said in the report. I've always been willing to say what I said in the report. I know you have. He could hear in Caroline Webb's voice something he'd heard in a few voices over the past 2 weeks. A quality that wasn't quite admiration, because she was too professional for that, but something adjacent to it, something like the acknowledgement that this particular client had been doing the right thing in every direction from the beginning and had paid for it in ways that most people in comparable situations had chosen not to pay, and that the math was now, slowly, painfully, correcting itself. One more thing, she said. Vivian Cross's legal team has been in contact. She wants to reach out to you directly. I told them I'd pass it on. It's entirely your call. Logan was quiet for a moment. Outside his kitchen window, the October rain was still coming down. The news vans were gone. They'd thinned out after day 4 and been gone entirely since the NTSB findings dropped, because the story had moved from his front block to the courtrooms and congressional offices where it was going to live for a while. The street looked like itself again. Tell them I heard her, Logan said finally. Tell them I'm not ready, but I heard her. Caroline Webb said she'd pass it on. He put the phone down and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ava did homework, where he'd read through the 47 pages at night, hoping to find something he'd gotten wrong, where they'd eaten pasta 3 nights ago, and she'd told him that Tyler Brentwood was confusing stupidity with principle. And he sat there for a long time in the rain light from the window, not reading anything, not calling anyone, just sitting with the weight of everything that had happened and the specific unresolved ache of a situation that was beginning to resolve. He was still sitting there when the school bus went past the window, and he heard the front door, and Ava came into the kitchen with her backpack still on, dropped something on the counter, and looked at him. What? She said. Nothing, he said. How was school? She looked at him with those dark, perceptive eyes that missed nothing and had never missed anything. You're doing the face, she said. What face? The one where you're thinking about something you don't know what to do with yet. He looked at his daughter. Yeah, he said. I guess I am. Wake it the way Tom Mrs. said. She put her backpack down and pulled out the chair across from him. His chair, technically, the one at the head of the table, the one he always sat in, which she was not supposed to take, and sat in it and looked at him with the patience of someone who had decided she was going to wait him out. Tell me, she said. He looked at her for a moment. She was 8 years old. She had her mother's eyes and his jaw, and something entirely her own in the way she looked at the world, like it owed her honesty, at minimum, and she was prepared to wait for it. Someone wants to say sorry to me, he said. Someone who did something that hurt us pretty bad, and I don't know what to do with that yet. Ava considered this with appropriate gravity. Is the sorry real? I think so, he said. Yeah, I think it's real. She was quiet for a moment. Then you kind of have to figure out what to do with it, she said. Right? Because a real sorry deserves something back. He looked at his daughter. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. Outside, the rain had slowed to something fine and almost invisible, more like mist than rain, the kind that settled on everything and made the street look new. Caroline Webb called on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the NTSB preliminary findings dropped, and told Logan that Asterian's legal team had made an offer. He was in the garage when she called, doing the kind of physical work his back could handle now, organizing, mostly, moving boxes from one side to the other with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been told by Dr. Anand that he could resume light activity, but that light meant light, and she would know if he lied about it. He didn't ask how she'd know. He believed her. How significant, he said, which was the question he and Caroline had agreed was the right first question. She told him the number. He set down the box he was holding. That's, he started. Yes, Caroline said. He stood in the garage for a moment, looking at the shelves of organized tools, the outline on the pegboard where each tool belonged, the system he'd built when he and his wife had first moved into this house 9 years ago, and which he'd maintained ever since, partly out of habit and partly because it was one of those small, controllable orders in a life that had contained a significant amount of disorder. Is there a non-disclosure component? He asked. They proposed one, Caroline said. I told them it was a non-starter. Given the regulatory proceedings and your planned testimony, any NDA would be legally unenforceable anyway, and they know it. The revised offer includes no restrictions on your public statements. And the timing on the regulatory testimony? The subcommittee has confirmed the date, 6 weeks out. Your testimony will be on the record, Logan. The engineering findings, the timeline, the suppression of the report, all of it. He picked up the box again and set it where it was supposed to go. Tell them yes on the settlement, and tell them I'll be there in 6 weeks. Already drafted, Caroline said. He could hear something in her voice that she probably thought she was concealing, a satisfaction that she was too professional to express directly, the satisfaction of someone who had spent 2 months watching a client absorb things that would have broken most people and had waited patiently for the math to correct itself. One more thing. Vivian Cross's team reached out again. She's asking for 15 minutes. In person or by phone, whatever you prefer. No lawyers present. Logan carried another box across the garage. Tell her in person, he said. Tell her I'll call her directly to set a time. There was a brief pause. Are you sure? No, he said honestly. But tell her anyway. He called Vivian Cross on a Saturday afternoon from the kitchen table while Ava was at Maya's for the day. The number Caroline had passed along rang twice before she picked up, and her voice when she said hello was careful in the way a voice is careful when it's been rehearsing the first word for several days and is still not certain it's ready. It's Logan, he said, which was unnecessary since she clearly knew, but he said it anyway because it gave both of them a second. Thank you for calling, she said. You wanted to meet? Yes, A pause. I have things I need to say to you that don't belong in a legal statement or a press conference, if you're willing to hear them. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the November light was thin and flat, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly older than it is. A neighbor was raking leaves across the street. The sound of it carried faintly through the glass. There's a park, he said, Kellner Park, on the east side. There's a bench near the pond on the south path. I take my daughter there on Sunday mornings sometimes. He stopped. I'll be there tomorrow at 10. Okay, she said. Vivian. He said her name and then wasn't sure what he'd intended to follow it with, so he just let it sit for a second. This isn't going to fix what happened. I know, she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely without argument. I'm not coming to fix it. I'm coming because you deserve to hear certain things from my mouth, not from a camera. He told her he'd see her tomorrow, and ended the call and sat at the kitchen table for a while, looking at the grain of the wood. Kellner Park on a Sunday morning in November was mostly empty. A man with a dog on a long leash near the east entrance. 2 older women walking together on the main path, talking with the unhurried intimacy of people who have been walking together for years. The pond was still and gray-green, reflecting the overcast sky. Logan was on the bench at 5 minutes to 10. He'd brought coffee in a travel mug, which he held with both hands, and he told Ava he had an errand, and she had looked at him with the specific expression of a person who knows they're not getting the full story, but has decided to allow it for now. Vivian Cross arrived at exactly 10. She was on foot, which meant she'd parked on the street outside, and she was wearing a dark coat and no visible bandage on her arm anymore, which meant it had healed faster than his back had, or she was covering it. She looked like herself, assembled, controlled, but with something underneath that had changed, something in the way she moved, a kind of deliberateness that had replaced whatever ease she'd carried before, like she was no longer taking for granted the simple act of being somewhere. She sat down on the other end of the bench, not too close, and looked at the pond. "I didn't know if you'd come," she said. "I said I would." "I know. People say things." She glanced at him. "You tend to mean what you say. I understand that about you now. I didn't when it mattered." He didn't respond to that. He drank his coffee. "I'm not going to tell you I was under pressure," she said, "or that I was working with incomplete information, or that the culture at Asterion made certain decisions feel less like choices than they actually were. All of that is true, and none of it is an excuse, and I'm done using true things as excuses." She was looking at the pond, speaking carefully, like she'd thought hard about each sentence, but was also aware that the sentences didn't fully contain what she was trying to say. "You told me the truth. You put it in 47 pages, and you sat across a table from me, and you said the words, and I made a decision about what mattered more than the truth. And people got hurt because of that decision. A little girl had blood on her face and couldn't get out of her seat, and that—" She stopped. She stopped for long enough that Logan looked at her. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were fixed on the middle distance with the expression of someone holding something in place through effort. "I replay it a lot," she said, quieter. "The cabin. Being stuck. Knowing exactly what I was in." She paused, and then hearing a voice. He didn't say anything. "I recognized you immediately," she said, "when you were asking if I could feel my feet. I recognized you, and I knew what I had done to you, and I thought—" She stopped again. "I thought you were going to leave me there. I thought that was what was going to happen, and I understood why it would happen. I understood it completely." "I wasn't going to leave you there," Logan said. "I know that now." "I wasn't going to leave you there then either." He looked at the pond. It's not who I am. Whatever you did, that's not who I am." She was quiet for a moment. "Who taught you to be like that?" He thought about it honestly. "The teams taught me some of it. The rest, my wife, my daughter." He paused. "Ava would not let me be anything less." "Your daughter." Vivian said it like she was handling something carefully. "How old is she?" 8. "She was there, at the field." "Yeah." He remembered Ava at the concrete barrier, backpack on, terror on her face, running toward him. "Her after-school ride stopped when they saw the smoke. She'd seen me go in." Vivian absorbed that. That must have been terrifying for her. It was. He looked at his coffee. "She handled it the way she handles everything, which is better than most adults I know." Something shifted in Vivian's expression. Not quite a smile, but in that direction. "She sounds like a serious person." "She's the most serious person I know. 8 years old, and she told me a real sorry deserves something back." Vivian looked at him. He met her eyes for the first time since she'd sat down. "Is this the part where I find out if it does?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Maybe," he said. "Say what you came to say." She turned back to the pond. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter and less constructed, like she'd set down something she'd been carrying. "I'm sorry I dismissed the report," she said. "I'm sorry I let Price turn your termination into a professional erasure. I'm sorry I signed off on a process that was designed to make sure you couldn't find work, because I convinced myself you were a liability instead of a person who was telling the truth. I'm sorry it took a crashed aircraft, and you going back into a fire for me to understand what I'd done." She stopped. "I know an apology doesn't rebuild what was lost. I know saying sorry to a man who spent 3 months driving a delivery van because of choices I made is, I know what it is. I'm not asking you to call it sufficient. I'm just telling you it's true." The park was quiet around them. The man with the dog had gone. The 2 women were somewhere on the far path, their voices inaudible now. Logan sat with what she'd said. He sat with it the way he'd been sitting with things since the crash, not rushing the processing, letting it settle to where it actually was rather than where he wished it was or feared it might be. "You lost your job," he said. "Yes. You didn't have to do the statement. The legal exposure was already there from the memo leak. You could have let the process work and stayed out of it." "I know. But you did it anyway." Yes. He looked at her. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Because you went back in, she said simply, and I couldn't answer that with silence. He nodded slowly. He looked at the pond. A bird landed on the surface near the far edge and sat there, perfectly still, for a moment, then was gone. I'm not there yet, he said. Forgiveness. I'm not there yet. I want to be clear about that. What happened to us, to our life in those 3 months, that's not something I can just set down because the math is correcting itself. I know, but I'm not. He stopped. Tried again. I don't want to hold on to it forever. That's not who I want to be. And it's not what I want to teach Ava. He exhaled. So I'm telling you I'm working on it. That's the most honest thing I can give you right now. Vivian Cross looked at him for a long moment. In the flat November light, her face was very still and very human, and he thought that this was probably the truest version of her. Not the boardroom version, or the press statement version, but this one, on a bench at a park pond, listening to a man tell her the honest truth about something hard. That's more than I deserve, she said. Probably, he agreed, but it's what I've got. She almost laughed. Not quite. It was more like the breath before a laugh, the shape of it. And then she looked away, and he could see her working something through. They sat there for a while without talking. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't the opposite of comfortable either. It was just two people on a bench in a November park, sitting with the weight of things. A voice came from the path behind them. Dad? Logan turned. Ava was standing 10 feet away on the gravel path, backpack on, Maya visible a little ways behind her with the expression of a woman who had not intended to arrive at exactly this moment, but had arrived at exactly this moment and was doing her best to be invisible about it. Ava was looking at Vivian Cross with the flat, assessing gaze of a child who has been told certain things and is now performing her own verification. Hey, Logan stood. I thought you were at Aunt Maya's. She brought me to the park. Ava was still looking at Vivian. Because I asked her to. He looked at Maya, who gave him a small shrug that meant, I know, but she asked, and that was that. Vivian had stood. She was looking at Ava with an expression Logan couldn't quite categorize. Something careful and uncertain, like a person approaching an animal that has every reason not to trust them and knows it. Ava walked past Logan and stopped in front of Vivian and looked up at her. Are you the one who fired my dad? She asked. The park was very quiet. Yes, Vivian said. She didn't soften it or explain it. She just said it. Ava looked at her for a moment. Are you sorry? Very, Vivian said. More than I know how to say. Ava considered this with the gravity she brought to things that mattered. My dad says the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes. It's what they do after. She paused. Did you do something after? Vivian's voice, when she answered, was not as steady as it had been. I'm trying to. Ava nodded slowly. Then she said, Okay, in the tone that meant she'd reached a conclusion and was prepared to act on it. She looked at the bench. Can we sit by the pond for a while? I like the pond. Logan looked at his daughter. She had already turned toward the bench and was deciding where to sit, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a person who had made her assessment and moved on. He looked at Vivian, who was looking at Ava with something in her expression that might, in a different light, have looked like the beginning of being undone. Yeah, Logan said. We can sit by the pond. They sat. Ava between them, because that was where she put herself, with no apparent awareness or concern about the significance of it, and looked at the water. And Ava asked Vivian what she did for work, now that she wasn't a CEO anymore. And Vivian said she wasn't sure yet. And Ava said that was okay, that her dad hadn't known what to do for a while either, and now he did. And this apparently settled the matter to her satisfaction. After a while, Ava found a stick and went to the edge of the pond to look at things in the water. And Logan and Vivian sat on the bench, and Maya sat on another bench a diplomatic distance away, pretending to look at her phone. She's extraordinary, Vivian said quietly. Yeah, Logan said. I know. Her mother, accident 5 years ago. She was 3. Vivian was quiet. I'm sorry. She doesn't remember much, but she has a lot of her mother in her. He watched Ava crouch by the water's edge, examining something with intense concentration. She's better than me. She's been better than me since she was about 5. Vivian looked at him. You know what I keep thinking about? She said. When you were in the cabin getting me out, you were burned. Your back was already burned, and you knew it. And you didn't... She stopped. You didn't mention it. You didn't use it. You just told me to move, and you got me out. He shrugged, slightly. Mentioning it wouldn't have helped either of us. Most people would have mentioned it. Most people weren't there, he said, which was true and also wasn't the full answer, but it was the answer he had. The congressional subcommittee hearing was 6 weeks later in December in a federal building in the city that smelled like old carpet and institutional coffee and the specific anxiety of people who are being watched saying things that will be part of the record permanently. Logan testified for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He brought the 47 pages. He answered every question directly and without editorializing, the way he'd been doing things his whole life. And when a committee member asked him whether he believed the existing regulatory framework was adequate to protect engineers who identified safety issues from corporate retaliation, he said no, clearly and without hesitation, and described specifically what adequate would look like. His testimony ran in full on 3 network news channels. Aviation industry websites picked it up in detail. A senator from Ohio who sat on the Aviation Safety Subcommittee referenced it by name in a floor statement 2 days later. Caroline Webb called him afterward and told him she'd been doing this for 19 years, and that was one of the more effective testimonies she'd seen in that room. I just said what was in the report, Logan told her. I know, she said. That's why it worked. The regulatory changes were drafted over the following months. A formal process, slow by design, with public comment periods and industry review, and all the apparatus of policy change that is frustrating until it isn't. Logan was part of the working group that drafted the whistleblower protection framework for certified engineers, which meant a lot of conference calls and a lot of documents, and one in-person session in Washington that he flew to on a Tuesday and flew back from on a Wednesday so he could be home to pick up Ava from school. She asked him at dinner how it went. Okay, he said. Long. A lot of talking about how to make sure what happened to me can't happen the same way again. She thought about it while eating. Can it happen a different way? Probably, he said honestly. People find ways around things. But making it harder matters. Making the cost of it higher matters. She nodded, because some people aren't brave enough to do the right thing if the cost is too high. He looked at her. Where did that come from? School. We were talking about history. Mrs. Carver says that's why rules matter. Because rules lower the cost of being good. She stabbed a piece of broccoli. I thought about you when she said it. He sat with that for a moment. That's a good teacher, he said. She's okay, Ava said, which in her vocabulary meant she was excellent. The Asterion executives, Price and the 2 others named in the memo chain, faced civil and criminal proceedings that moved, as proceedings do, with the lurching slowness of institutional justice. Logan gave a deposition in January. He was precise and factual and left the room with the feeling of a man who has done everything asked of him and turned the rest of it over to processes he doesn't control, which is a feeling that requires a particular kind of acceptance that he was still working on. The settlement from Asterion cleared in February. He paid off the truck, paid 6 months ahead on the mortgage, set aside what he needed for Ava's future, and put the rest somewhere it could be useful when he figured out what useful meant. He and Vivian met at the park again in January, and again in February. The meetings had the slightly odd quality of something that didn't have a clear category. Not friendship exactly, not professional acquaintance, not anything with a clean name. They were 2 people who were connected by a sequence of events that neither would have chosen, and both were responsible for in different ways, trying to figure out what, if anything, came after that. They talked sometimes about the crash, what they'd each experienced, what they remembered, the specific details that had stayed with them. They talked about the company, about what had gone wrong structurally and culturally before the engineering failures, about the particular way institutional pressure could make smart people choose to be less than they were. Vivian talked about this with an unflinching quality that Logan found more trustworthy than any apology, because it was harder. She asked him once, in February, standing up from the bench at the end of one of these conversations, if he would ever be able to stop seeing the person who fired him when he looked at her. He considered it honestly. "I already see other things too," he said. "That's progress." She looked at him for a moment. "Is it enough?" "It's what I have right now," he said. "I'm not going to tell you it's more than it is." She nodded. She had learned to receive his honesty as the thing it was. Not unkindness, but the opposite of it. Ava, for her part, had developed opinions about Vivian Cross that were characteristically direct and characteristically her own. She thought Vivian needed to learn how to eat lunch instead of working through it. She thought Vivian's voice got tight when she was nervous, and she should breathe more. She thought Vivian was sorry in a real way, and that real sorry deserved something real back, which she had already told Logan and which Logan had told her he was working on. "Working on it takes too long," Ava told him one evening. "Some things do," he said. "But you know you're going to get there." He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. She was doing homework again, a book report this time, which she had stronger feelings about than long division, almost all of them negative. "Yeah," he said, "I know I'm going to get there." "So stop making it so hard." He almost laughed. It came out as something that wasn't quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood, a real sound, not performed. "It's not that simple, Ava." "I know it's not simple," she said, with great patience. "I said stop making it hard. Those are different things." He looked at his 8-year-old daughter. She went back to her book report with the air of a person who had said what needed to be said and was prepared to let it land on its own schedule. Logan sat at the kitchen table in the evening light and thought about the difference between complicated and hard. He thought about 47 pages and 3 months of silence and a burning aircraft and a choice he'd made in a tilted cabin with bad air and amber light. He thought about a park bench in November and a serious 8-year-old between two adults who were both trying to figure out what they owed each other and the world. He thought about his wife, the way he always thought about her, quietly, with the specific grief that no longer incapacitated him, but never fully went away. The grief that had settled into him like weather settles into old wood, part of the structure now. He thought about what it would mean to set something down. Not because it had stopped mattering, but because holding it was costing him something he'd rather spend differently. It didn't arrive all at once. It never does. But sitting at the kitchen table while his daughter wrote a book report about a book she philosophically objected to, Logan Mercer felt something shift. Not dramatically, not completely, but genuinely. Like a load-bearing thing that had been under stress for a long time finally beginning to find a new equilibrium. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the direction of it. And for now, in the way that for now has to be enough sometimes, that was enough. The idea started the way most real things start, not with a grand announcement or a clear plan, but with a conversation that neither of them had intended to be the conversation it became. It was a Thursday evening in March, 7 months after the crash, and Logan and Vivian were sitting in the kitchen of his house for the first time, a threshold that had been crossed not ceremonially, but practically, because the park bench in March was cold enough that Ava had complained about it with the specific relentlessness of a person who believes complaints, properly sustained, eventually become arguments. So they'd moved inside, and now Vivian Cross was sitting across the kitchen table from Logan Mercer, drinking coffee that he'd made too strong, and she hadn't said anything about. And Ava was doing homework at the counter with her back to them in the way that meant she was listening to everything. They'd been talking about the regulatory working group, a specific provision Logan had been pushing for that would require independent third-party review of safety reports flagged by certified engineers before a company could proceed with certification. It was getting resistance from industry lobbying groups, which was predictable, and it was getting slower traction with the subcommittee than he'd hoped, which was frustrating. The problem, Logan said, is that the framework still puts the review mechanism inside the existing relationship between the company and the regulator. You can't fix a capture problem by asking the captured party to review itself more carefully. Vivian was quiet for a moment. You need the review to sit outside the certification body entirely. Yes. which means a separate entity with its own funding structure and no financial relationship to the manufacturers, which is what I've been saying for 4 months, and which the industry representatives keep calling impractical. It's not impractical, Vivian said. It's expensive, and it removes leverage from people who currently have it, which they're calling impractical because that sounds better. She turned her coffee mug in her hands. What if the entity already existed? What if it wasn't something that needed to be legislated into being, but something that was operating and demonstrating proof of concept before the regulatory mandate caught up? Logan looked at her. I'm not in a position to build anything right now, she said carefully. I want to be clear about what I'm and what I'm not saying. But I've been thinking. She stopped, started again. I have resources. I have industry relationships, some of which survived the past 7 months, and some of which I can rebuild. And I have a pretty clear understanding of exactly where the system fails, because I was the person who ran one of the failures. What are you proposing? Logan said. It wasn't quite a question. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to think about it with me. From the counter, without turning around, Ava said, You should do it. Logan and Vivian both looked at her. Ava, Logan said, I'm just saying. She turned a page in her textbook, still not turning around. You both know exactly what went wrong and exactly how to fix it. That's not common. You should probably not waste that. Logan looked at Vivian. Vivian was looking at the back of Ava's head with an expression that had become more legible to him over the months, something between fondness and the kind of respect you have for a person who consistently says the clearest version of the thing. She's right, Vivian said. She usually is, Logan said. He thought about it for 3 weeks. He thought about it in the way he thought about things that mattered, systematically, honestly, without rushing to the answer he might prefer. He walked through the practical questions: funding, structure, whether the idea was genuinely viable or whether it was the kind of idea that feels clarifying in a kitchen conversation and reveals its problems in the light of actual execution. He talked to Caroline Webb about legal structures. He talked to a former colleague from his naval aviation days who now worked in independent safety certification and who said, with the bluntness Logan had always appreciated about him, the market for this exists, has always existed, and has been suppressed by people with financial reasons to suppress it. If you can build credibility fast enough to overcome the institutional resistance, it works. If you can't, it doesn't. He talked to Maya, who said, Logan, you have been trying to do this your entire career from inside companies that didn't want you to. What would it look like from the outside? He sat with that one for a while. He called Vivian on a Tuesday night and told her he was in, with conditions, and she said, tell me the conditions. And he did. And she said yes to all of them without negotiating, which told him she'd thought through them already and had arrived at the same conclusions. The conditions were these: every safety review they conducted would be published, regardless of what it found. Every engineer on their team would have documented protection against retaliation. Every client would sign a covenant agreeing that a negative safety finding could be made public, and that no contractual relationship with the firm could be conditioned on the outcome of a review. And the firm would accept no contract from any company that had, in the preceding 5 years, been found to have suppressed a safety report. That last condition eliminated a significant portion of the potential client base immediately. I know, Logan said when Vivian pointed this out. I'm not arguing against it, she said. I'm making sure you know. I know, he said again. They named the company Meridian Safety Group, which was Ava's suggestion, offered at breakfast one Saturday morning when Logan had mentioned they were still working on a name. She'd said it with the matter-of-fact confidence of a person who had clearly been thinking about it for some time without being asked, and then gone back to her cereal. And Logan had looked at the word for a moment and understood why it was right. A meridian is a reference line, a fixed point from which you measure things, and that was exactly what they were trying to build. It was not easy. That needs to be said plainly, because the version of this story that gets told afterward always has a tendency to compress the difficult middle, the months of building something from structural principles and professional will, and the recurring grinding awareness that credibility in this industry is not given but accumulated, slowly, through decisions that cost something. The first 6 months of Meridian were mostly meetings and documents and conversations with potential clients who were interested in theory and cautious in practice and who asked, with the polite skepticism of people who had been operating in the existing system for a long time, whether an independent safety review firm could actually deliver what it promised, or whether it would, over time, find ways to soften its findings the way every other external review body eventually softened its findings when the financial pressure reached a certain threshold. Logan answered that question the same way every time. "We publish everything," he said. "The first time we don't, we're done anyway, because the only thing we're selling is the guarantee that we will, so we're not going to stop." Some of them believed him, some of them didn't. The ones who didn't weren't wrong to be skeptical. This industry had given them reasons to be skeptical, and Logan didn't hold it against them. He just continued doing the thing because continuing to do the thing was the only argument available. Vivian ran the operational and financial side with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned expensively which parts of running a company matter and which parts are elaborate ways of avoiding the parts that matter. She was a different executive than she'd been at Asterion. Logan could see it in the specific ways she made decisions now. The care she took with the people who worked for them, the way she treated a concern raised by a junior team member as something to be investigated rather than managed. She didn't talk about it directly, but it was visible in everything she did. The way the effects of significant experiences are always visible in people who have actually absorbed them rather than just survived them. They disagreed, sometimes sharply. Vivian wanted to pursue a contract with a mid-sized aircraft manufacturer in the Southeast that Logan had reservations about, not because of anything specific in their record, but because something in the structure of the initial conversation had felt to him like a company looking for cover rather than oversight. He said so. Vivian said his instinct wasn't a compliance standard. He said he knew that and still didn't want the contract. They went back and forth for 2 weeks, with the kind of productive friction that happens between people who respect each other enough to push back. And ultimately, Logan pulled together enough documented concerns about the manufacturer's internal review processes to make a reasonable case, and Vivian looked at it for a day and said, "Okay, not this one." "You could have just trusted me on it," Logan said afterward. "I do trust you," she said. "I also need to be able to explain our decisions with something more than your gut, because our decisions are public record." "Fair," he said. "Also," she added, "your gut was right. That's why I looked until I found the documentation." He looked at her. She was already back to the document on her laptop, and there was something in her profile, in the particular focus of it, the way she worked with a concentration that was no longer about performance or pressure, but just about getting the thing right. That was different from the woman who had sat at the head of a 32nd floor boardroom in a height-adjusted chair. He didn't say this out loud, but he noted it. Their first major contract was a regional commuter aircraft manufacturer in the Pacific Northwest, a company that had been building solid, unremarkable aircraft for 20 years and wanted independent certification support for a new composite frame design they were developing. The review took 4 months. Logan led the technical team personally, with 2 senior engineers he'd recruited from former colleagues in the industry, people whose professional judgment he trusted specifically because he'd seen them make expensive calls in the right direction when the pressure was going the other way. They found 3 issues. One was minor and was corrected in the design phase without significant impact to the timeline. One was moderate and required a 6-week redesign of a wing junction component. One was serious enough that Logan sat across the table from the manufacturer's chief engineer and told him, with the directness that had been costing him things his entire career and was now the core of his professional value, that they could not certify the design as it stood. The chief engineer, a man named Dwight Farrow, who had 30 years in and the wary look of a person who has been through several of these conversations, looked at Logan for a long moment. "What would it take?" Farrow said. "A structural redesign of the forward pressure bulkhead interface," Logan said. "It's a 4 to 6 month process. It delays your launch window." "By how much?" 6 months minimum, possibly 8. Farrow looked at the table. "The board is going to want to know why an independent reviewer found something our internal team missed." "Your internal team didn't miss it," Logan said. "They flagged a concern in the preliminary review, and it was reclassified as within tolerance by senior engineering. I have the document trail." He paused. I'd recommend having a conversation with whoever made that reclassification before the board meeting. Farrow looked at him, a long, measured look, the look of a man recalibrating. You're going to publish this finding, Farrow said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Logan said. That's what we do. Another pause. Okay, Farrow said. Show me the redesign parameters. The finding was published. The redesign was completed in 5.5 months. When Meridian certified the corrected design, that certification was also published, with the full record of the issue, the timeline, and the specific changes that had been made. The aviation trade press ran it as a case study. 3 other manufacturers contacted Meridian within the following month. It wasn't fast. It wasn't frictionless. There were quarters where the financials were uncomfortable, and Logan and Vivian had candid, unglamorous conversations about resource allocation and client pipeline and whether they were building something sustainable or something admirable that would eventually run out of runway. Those conversations were hard in the specific way that hard conversations between 2 people who have been through harder things are hard. Honestly, without drama, with the practical focus of people who have learned that the time spent in denial is time you don't get back. But they kept building. Logan's role in the FAA Regulatory Working Group eventually produced language. Not everything he'd proposed, that's never how it works, but the core of it. The independent review provision made it into the proposed rule. The engineer whistleblower protections were strengthened in 2 specific ways that Caroline Webb, who had followed the process with professional interest, told him were more durable than the original language he'd submitted. The public comment period closed with an overwhelming ratio of support from working engineers across the industry, which turned out to be the most effective argument available. He testified twice more before the process was complete. Each time he brought the same 47 pages, not because the committee needed them anymore, but because he had decided they were going to be present in that room every time he was. The regulation passed in October, 14 months after the crash. Logan was in Washington for the announcement, and then he was on the first flight home because Ava had a school presentation the next morning about the water cycle and had made him promise he'd be there. And he was. He sat in the back of the classroom in a small plastic chair that was not designed for a man his size, while Ava stood at the front with a poster she'd made and explained, with great seriousness and more precision than most adults bring to the subject, how water moves through the atmosphere and back to the earth, in a continuous system where nothing is ever actually lost. It just changes form. He watched his daughter stand in front of her class and explain a system to them, and he thought about things that change form. The first aircraft, Meridian, fully certified, from initial design review through final certification sign-off, was a light business jet produced by a manufacturer they'd been working with for 11 months. The certification process had been the most thorough Logan had ever been part of, which was saying something. Every system, every joint, every load-bearing component reviewed independently, every finding documented and addressed before proceeding, every engineer on the team empowered to stop the process if something wasn't right. There had been 11 stops, 3 of them significant, all of them resolved correctly before moving forward. The jet was scheduled for its maiden flight on a Tuesday morning in April. 2 years and 6 months after the morning, Logan had worn the wrong tie to a meeting on the 32nd floor. The flight would take off from a private airfield east of the city, a 45-minute drive from Logan's house in Renton. A small group of people had been invited. The manufacturer's team, Meridian's core engineering staff, a few industry observers, and the journalists from 2 aviation publications who had been following the Meridian story since the Farrow case study. Logan had told Ava about it a week in advance, partly because he always told her things in advance so she could prepare herself mentally, which was a thing she'd told him she needed when she was 6, and he'd been doing ever since, and partly because this one felt like something she should be there for. "Can I miss school?" she asked immediately. "It's on a Tuesday." "So yes?" "I'll clear it with Mrs. Carver." She looked at him with the expression of someone who has achieved a desired outcome and is trying not to look too pleased about it. "Is Vivian going to be there?" "She's part of the company, Ava." "I know. I'm asking if she's going to be there." He looked at his daughter. She was 10 and a half now, and the specific perceptiveness that had always characterized her had with age become something even more precise. She saw things and she named them, with the particular directness of a person who had never fully understood the social convention that required you to pretend you hadn't noticed something you'd clearly noticed. "Yes," he said, "she's going to be there." Ava nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said, and went back to what she was doing. The morning of the maiden flight was clear, not dramatically clear, not the cinematic blue that makes everything look like a statement, just a regular April Tuesday that had decided to be decent, the sky pale and clean with a light wind out of the northwest, and the kind of temperature where a jacket was right, and a coat was too much. Logan drove with Ava, and they picked up Maya on the way because Maya had asked if she could come, and Logan had said, of course. "Are you nervous?" Maya asked from the back seat. "No," Logan said. "You're lying." "A little nervous," he said. "Not about the aircraft. The aircraft is right." "Then what?" He thought about it. "I'm nervous it's going to mean less than I think it should. That it's going to be, I don't know, an airplane taking off." Maya was quiet for a moment. "And if it is just an airplane taking off, then I'll be fine with that too," he said. "But I've been working towards something for a long time, and sometimes when things arrive, they're smaller than the space you made for them." Ava, in the passenger seat, said, "It won't be." "You don't know that." "I know you," she said. "You've been working toward this your whole life, not just since the crash. Your whole life. It won't be small." He drove for a moment without answering. "When did you get so certain about everything?" he asked. "I've always been certain," she said. "You just weren't paying attention." He laughed. A real one, short and genuine, and Maya laughed in the back seat, and Ava permitted herself a small smile of the variety that meant she knew it was funny and was choosing not to make too much of it. The airfield was modest, a private operation with a single paved runway and a small terminal building and a hangar where the jet had been housed during its final preparation. The Meridian team was already there when Logan arrived, 12 engineers in jackets with the company logo, a clean, simple Meridian line standing near the runway threshold with the slightly formal quality of people who are trying to contain their feeling of occasion. The manufacturer's team was larger, 30-odd people, a mix of engineers and executives, and the kind of support staff that attend these things and takes photographs. Logan found Vivian near the hangar door. She was talking to Dwight Farrow, who had, after the Meridian review of his manufacturer's aircraft, become something of an unexpected advocate, and who had introduced two of their subsequent clients. And she looked up when Logan walked over, and there was something in her face that he recognized now, after 2.5 years of working alongside her, as the expression she had when she was feeling something she was managing carefully. "How's it looking?" Logan said. "Perfect," Farrow said. "And I don't use that word with aircraft." Logan nodded. He looked at the jet, which had been moved out of the hangar and sat on the apron in the April morning light, white with a gray accent line, clean and proportionate, not dramatic. An airplane that looked exactly like what it was. He walked over to it alone and put his hand on the fuselage just ahead of the wing root, the way he'd been putting his hands on aircraft his entire professional life, reading the material through his palm the way you can't read it any other way. He stood there for a moment. Ava appeared beside him. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Just being here for a second." She stood next to him and looked at the aircraft with the serious attention she gave to things that mattered. "Is it safe?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. Without the qualifier he'd have needed to add to any aircraft he hadn't been through the way he'd been through this one. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She thought about that for a moment. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "That day, the crash." She was still looking at the aircraft, not at him. "You knew. Before it happened, you knew it was going to fail." "I knew it could," he said carefully. "I knew the conditions for it. And you couldn't stop it." "I tried. I was one person, and the system wasn't set up to listen to one person." She was quiet for a moment. "Does that still make you angry?" He considered the question honestly. "Sometimes," he said, "less than it used to." "Because of this?" She gestured at the aircraft, the team, the airfield. Partly, he looked at her. Mostly because I figured out that angry was just grief looking for somewhere to go. The grief was about the people who got hurt, who didn't have to get hurt. And I could either keep pointing the grief at Asterion and Vivian and Price and everyone who made those decisions, or I could... He stopped. I could turn it into something that actually did what I'd been trying to do the whole time. Ava looked at him for a long moment with her mother's dark eyes and her own serious face. She's not the same person anymore, she said. Vivian. No. I didn't think she was at the start, at the park. She paused. But she's really not. People can change, Logan said, when something costs them enough, when they let it cost them instead of trying to get around it. Did you change? He thought about it. I got clear, he said, about what I was willing to spend myself on, about what the point of things is. He looked at the aircraft. I always knew what I believed. He paused. I understand it differently now, what it costs, what it's worth. Ava nodded slowly, the nod she gave when she was storing something. Vivian came up beside them. She stood on Logan's other side and looked at the aircraft, and there was a moment, just a moment, where the three of them stood there together in the April light with the morning wind coming from the northwest and the quiet, purposeful sound of a small airfield preparing to do what airfields do. Ready? Vivian said. Yeah, Logan said. The pilot was a woman named Sasha Reeves. No relation to the NTSB investigator, she'd established this early and with some amusement, who had 22 years of experimental aircraft experience and the unhurried competence of a person who finds high-stakes things clarifying rather than frightening. She did a walk-around of the aircraft with Logan that lasted 35 minutes, which was longer than some people in the group expected, but exactly as long as Logan had planned. And at the end of it, she looked at him and said, clean. And he said, clean. And that was the exchange. He stood at the runway threshold with Vivian on his left and Ava on his right. Maya was a few steps behind with the rest of the group. The jet taxied to the far end of the runway with the careful, slightly awkward grace of aircraft on the ground, which always seemed to Logan to be one of the more honest things about them. The way something designed for the air reveals its limitations when it's on the earth. The way it's only fully itself when it's doing what it was built to do. The engine note changed. The aircraft began to move. It was not a dramatic moment in the way dramatic moments are described. It was an aircraft accelerating down a runway on an April morning, doing what aircraft do, which is reach the speed at which the laws of physics that apply to everything else temporarily agree to step aside. It was a normal thing, done correctly. And then it lifted and it climbed, and the angle was right, and the rate was right, and Logan watched it go with his hand briefly at his side and then in his pocket, watching the aircraft he had certified rise into the clear, pale sky on a Tuesday morning in April, and he felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not triumph, not vindication. Those are the feelings you have about other people, about what other people did or failed to do, about scores and accounts. This was different. This was the feeling of something being completed, the feeling of a thing that was supposed to exist coming into existence. Ava took his hand. He looked down at her. She was watching the aircraft climb, squinting slightly into the light, her jaw set with the particular expression she had when she was feeling something but wasn't going to make a performance of it. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. Vivian, beside him, said nothing for a while. She watched the aircraft until it banked gently eastward and began its first circuit, holding its altitude with the steady confidence of something well-built doing what it was built to do. You certified it? She said, finally. We certified it, Logan said. She looked at him. There was something in her face that was not quite at peace. He didn't think either of them would get to something that simple, not completely, not given everything, but that was in the direction of it. The direction that people move when they have done something real with the wreckage of something terrible, and the real thing is standing in front of them, and they are finally in a position to see it for what it is. Logan, she said. Yeah. Thank you. She said it the way she'd learned over 2 years to say the things that meant what they said. Not to fill silence, not as social scaffolding, because she meant it, and because meaning it was what she'd learned to do with the things that cost her. He looked at her. "We did good work," he said. "Yes," she said, "we did." The aircraft completed its first circuit and began its second, the engine note changing slightly as it trimmed into the turn, and the sound of it carried down to them across the morning air, steady and clean and right. Ava watched it go. She was still holding Logan's hand, and her expression had changed from the set concentration of a person holding something in to something more open, more at ease. A 10-year-old girl in April watching an airplane fly and finding it, just for this moment, just right now, sufficient. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "You did it." He looked at his daughter, this serious, clear-eyed person who had been telling him true things since she was 5 years old from the back of a school drop-off line, who had sat between two adults on a park bench in November and asked the right questions with the simple directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the answers, who had told him that complicated and hard were different things and that he should stop confusing them. He thought about what it costs to tell the truth when the truth is inconvenient. He thought about what it costs to go back in when you have every reason not to. He thought about what it costs to let something change you all the way through instead of just on the surface, and what comes out on the other side of that cost when you pay it honestly. He thought about his wife, the way he always thought about her, quietly, with love that had nowhere to go except into the life he was still living, and the person he was still becoming, and the daughter who carried her eyes. He looked at the aircraft climbing into the April sky, and he thought, this is what the 47 pages were for. Not the settlement, not the regulation, not the vindication of being right. This, a safe aircraft in clean air, built by people who were not willing to trade a human life for a deadline, certified by engineers who were not willing to be silent when silence was the easier thing. This. Just this. "Yeah," Logan Mercer said to his daughter, in the April light with the sound of a Wright engine in a clear sky above them. "We did." He was not a perfect man. He had never been. He was a man who had lost things and kept going, who had been wrong about how much institutions could be trusted and had refused to pretend otherwise, who had burned his back in a field for a woman who had taken something from him and had not been able to make himself leave her there because that was not the person he was, the person his wife had loved, the person his daughter was watching become himself again. He was not finished. There would be other fights, other findings, other rooms where the inconvenient truth sat on the table and someone had to decide whether to say it. There would be days when the weight of what had happened would settle on him without warning, in the specific way grief and anger do when you think you've processed them. And then a light falls a certain way, or a sound catches you off guard. There would be hard quarters and difficult clients, and moments in the middle of the night when he lay awake running load calculations in his head that had nothing to do with aircraft. That was the honest version. That was the version that was true. But standing in the April light with his daughter's hand in his and a certified aircraft in the sky above him and a company he'd built on the one principle he had never been willing to surrender, Logan Mercer understood something that he thought he'd known before, but had only now actually reached the bottom of. The mission was never the battlefield. The mission had always been this: protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves, building the thing that should exist, raising his daughter to look at the world and not look away. The aircraft completed its circuit and came in for landing, smooth and correct, and touched down on the runway with the particular sound of tires meeting pavement that engineers call uneventful, which is the best thing you can call it, which is the whole point. Ava watched it land and then looked up at him. "What's the lesson today?" she asked. It was not a drop-off line. It was not a Tuesday morning, but she asked because it was their thing, and because she knew him, and because she was, in the way that the best people in your life are, still paying attention. He thought about it honestly. He thought about everything he'd learned in the shape of it. Not the headline version, not the compressed version that would make sense from the outside, but the actual thing, the thing that had cost him and changed him and brought him here to this runway on this morning. "The truth," he said finally, "is never the obstacle. It's always the foundation. And if you build on it, even when it's slow, even when it costs you, Even when the people in the tall chairs tell you it's inconvenient, what you build will hold. Ava considered this. That's the longest one yet, she said. It was a long lesson. She looked at the aircraft, now taxiing back to the apron, and she looked at Vivian, who was walking toward it with two members of the engineering team. And she looked at the morning sky where the aircraft had been, pale and clear and going on. Then she looked back at her father. It held, she said simply. And that was enough. That was in the end exactly enough.